When we talk about buck breaking, we have to understand that buck breaking is a show of power. It's a show of dominance. So we can't talk about buck breaking without talking about power.
The dominant society, they spend a lot of money and resources pushing different types of agendas to black society because they try to confuse us sexually. And if they can confuse you sexually, as our brother Neely Fuller said, they can confuse you in any other type of way.
When we look at the domination of black people by the dominant society, what we are in essence seeing is that this society wants to ensure that we are not able to actually mete out that thing that makes humans exist, and that is creating families and procreating.
See, psychologically, when we're talking about the sexualizing of our people, primarily from the dominant society or the system of white supremacy, it had to be established in a very impinging way from the mental state, meaning everything that was done had to have a sexual undertone. Most of the time, it was mostly direct. So you had to enforce a level of dominance sexually in order to destroy the mind and the spirit simultaneously. So it was always, everything that I do, I'm going to reinforce it sexually. Everything that I say, I'm going to reinforce it sexually. Everything that I am going to manipulate and use on you has to be done sexually in order for you to understand that you are controlled. You are my slave. You are beneath me in every single way, shape, and form.
This whole notion that masculinity is somehow toxic and detrimental to society is nothing but an attempt to emasculate black malehood.
When you take away someone's right to deny sexual sex acts that go beyond norm, then you violated the human being space of that person.
It's clearly an agenda. If you have two eyes in your head and you're able to see, you can see that it's an agenda, and it's an agenda to decrease our population.
See, LGBTQ is like a political party, like the Democrats or the Republicans. So if you're black, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a Democrat. You couldn't be an independent or a Republican.
It's always been about destroying the black family. The family's the foundation of a people. You can't mistreat people if they're unified. You need division. You need all sorts of pathological behavior and conduct.
See, they're first order beings on this planet. People like us, we're first orders. Why? Because we don't need anybody else's energies except our own. But second order entities need to feed on you because they don't have a direct connection to the One Most High.
The heterosexual black male is last on the pecking order here in America. If you're just a heterosexual black man, how are you gonna beat the case? Because when you show up to court, when you show up to the job interview, when you show up to wherever, you coming in here as a heterosexual black man, you have no power.
When Mark Twain confessed that we, white people, ground the manhood out of the Negro. Why ground the manhood out of the Negro? Because it's black masculinity that most exposes the fraud of white masculinity.
We, as the progenitors of culture, the ones who are the fathers and mothers of civilizations, who taught all people, who people look to for social cues, whether they want to realize it or not, I think they feel if they can get us to adapt to it, they can get everybody to adapt to it.
If anybody should have a problem with European males, it should be the European female. Because everything the European male has ever learned to do to us, he first practiced on his own woman.
We need resources in education, we need resources in labor, we need resources in politics, we need resources in medical, we need resources in so many things, but they ignore that and they put millions and even billions of dollars to tell us that you need to really embrace your LBGT side. So these people have an agenda, and it's up to us to understand what the agenda is.
In order for us to fully grasp the concept of buck breaking and the historic sexual exploitation of black people under the global system of white supremacy, we first have to go back into the history of Europe, and we have to understand what created this ideology and the mindset of the white supremacists.
European culture have no history of a civilizing educational process called culture before they meet us. So you're dealing with someone that's moving from the level of the animal, responding only to instincts and desires. And whatever it takes to fulfill that, raping, murdering, plundering, pillaging has been the history of Europe.
They created a perverted way of looking at nature. And so it becomes important that when we look at them, it's not just what they do, it's the perversion of what they do. In an ice age, you're going to create a certain mentality. When you are in a sun age, you're going to create a certain mentality. So what is very natural becomes unnatural in the ice. However, when you come back to the natural, you bring your unnatural with you.
The European sexual culture operated at the level of animal, responding to physical yearn and physical stimulation. The sacredness and the value that the African placed on giving birth was just the complete opposite in Europe. And so that's why you find so many occasions of Europeans involving themselves with the animals they were raising. I mean, they've passed laws in Scandinavian countries even today that said having sex with sheep is appropriate.
The Greeks had gods devoted to, like Pan, which is a freak, like a satyr, which means like an animal that did people and animals. Or Ganymede, the god that was bisexual. If he showed up, you had to like give him some. It was good. If you didn't, you got in trouble. I mean, you have people who have a pantheon where you have gods that are freaks that come and screw people. Some of them are almost animal-like. You've got Bacchus. If you look at, I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of Bacchus, but I've seen a picture of Bacchus where he's a dude carrying this big thing of wine with hummingbirds or something with strings holding his penis up. A big, long penis, a big thing of booze. If that's your God, okay, I mean, all bets off the table that it stops there, right?
When the Aryans, the Indo-Aryans, ran up into Black India, not only did they savage the place, not only did they brag and boast in their sacred literature about flaying the black gods, flaying the black skin of the gods, but they bragged about sodomizing the black gods.
As a matter of fact, as a part of their culture, you have agreements. This is how it was. If you had a boy that you were, having sexual relations with, 12, 13, 14, 15, you'd have to do a number of things. One, you'd have to promise him protection. Two, you'd have to promise that you would educate him. Three, you'd have to make sure that you would always provide for him, whatever that may be. There were actual terms and agreements when it came to you having sexual relations with a little boy back in ancient Greek and Rome.
Professor Jane Ward, for example, in her book, Not Gay, documents that a critical element of white male masculinity is the ability to have gay sex as a straight white man. She said that's a critical element of white male masculinity. So the very concept of white masculinity is predicated upon the ability to sodomize, to have.
A human being is only as great or as worse as his or her environment. In an ice age, where you are dealing with these temperatures, your babies are freezing in your arms to death. No mercy. And so they have this mentality of just a viciousness because they are reflecting their environment. And so when the ice ages began to melt, give or take about maybe 5,000, 7,000 years ago, they came back across the mountains. And when they came back across the mountains, they brought that mentality with them. When you're in the ice, you're not really thinking about healthy relationships. And quite frankly, when the urge hits you, any hole will do.
Heterosexual sex for the white man, the only purpose of that is procreation. In fact, sex with a woman was a necessary evil to white folks. For pleasure, homosexual sex is preferred.
When Europeans ventured out and first began to interact with black society, there was a notable contrast of sexual behavior between these two cultures.
Typically, when people talk about buck breaking, they start on the plantation and they begin with the sexual abuse that our ancestors suffered on the plantation. But that sexual abuse started in West Africa when the Portuguese first encountered the West African men and women.
When we see all of the statues of naked Greeks and Romans with their extremely small penises, I think that we have to recognize that in some ways they are trying to emulate the African comfort with our bodies, but because this is not something that is native to their cultural norm, it begins to be misshapen.
What man from what ethnic group can stand up against a black man toe to toe in manhood? Nobody. Especially the European, who is at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to genetic stability.
All the way back in Rome, in Greece, some of the rulers were transgenders. They would travel at night dressed as women to go hang out at brothels and go mingle with the people as a woman. This is the king of the whole nation, and he hanging out here looking like Betsy.
I remember reading an article many years ago about Romans in the Colosseum used to get giraffes to have sex with the old horse, and the giraffes had such large genitalia, women would bleed to death, and the audiences loved it.
When white Arabs began to gain control over parts of black society, there was an immediate attack on black male sexuality, and an early form of buck breaking, the castration of black males and turning them into eunuchs, began to happen on a regular basis.
They said the eunuchs would be sometimes so close to the king that they would get so much information. So they'd castrate them so that they couldn't start their own dynasties. Okay, they couldn't go out and now impregnate somebody with this knowledge, this king knowledge.
They would castrate them by cutting off their testicles and their penis completely because of population control and due to them not wanting them to procreate. This goes all the way back then, and they did not want any spread of them because they didn't consider them to be human beings. So at that time, the castrating and the creation of eunuchs was, we don't mind allowing you to be around us, but we have to make sure that you can't dominate us, that you have no power drive, that you have no interest whatsoever in our women, because you're going to destroy our numbers and you're going to increase in yours and you're going to spread, and we don't want that to happen. So they wouldn't mind having little black boys or black men around them as long as they could not actually be considered men and do anything that would be of interest to the women that they had.
Or you look at the ancient Greeks, the most feared fighters were the gay ones. And what would they do? They would tie two guys together at the ankle. If you've ever heard the expression, the joined at the ankle, that's because they get two guys that liked each other, tie their ankles together. They die for each other, put them up. They fight anybody. You can go touch my man, I'll kill you. Don't look at my man.
Yeah. Well, why would anybody be shocked about a gay person in Africa when you've got the Catholic Church, which is a gay institution, a continuation of the Greco-Roman pedophilia and homosexuality in Africa, dominating these people for 200 or 300 years.
It is the case that there is evidence of homosexuality prior to the colonialism of the 19th century. But that pre-colonial homosexuality was brought by white Muslims. It's still, while it's pre-European, it's still foreign and white. It was the Turks who brought in the Mamluks, when the Mamluks, the slave soldiers of Islamic civilization, who were Turks, when they ruled Egypt, they brought homosexuality to Africa.
I think it's really interesting that right in the center of St. Peter's Square, when the Pope opens the shades to his window, he looks out at the structure that is often called the obelisk today. We should know that the obelisk is the symbol of the Tsar's erect penis. So that while they're removing penises, the Pope looks out at a large black penis every morning when he opens his shades. The irony cannot be lost.
By the time the plantation systems were created in the Americas, the white supremacists learned how to master more strategic and insidious ways on how to buck break black men, and by extension, they learned how to break the spirit of black families.
Because in the patriarchal context, the male is considered the strength. And so if you break the male, then you break the woman and you break the children. So when I think of buck breaking, I don't solely think about just the male per se. And then we have to understand that it also wasn't just sex either. You know, when you're breaking somebody, you can break them spiritually, you know, do different things. It doesn't have to be just sodomy. And so a lot of us, when we focus on buck breaking, we think about the African man or the African captive being taken out, you know, on the plantation, being brought in front of, you know, the women and children and sodomized in front of everybody. But another part of buck breaking is not being able to protect your children, being able to protect your women, not being able to provide for them. That's also breaking the man mentally and spiritually.
On plantations like this, we know that a lot of the black women who were enslaved here were exploited sexually, and we know this because of the offspring and the children they had. The children were mulatto, octoroon, so that was the evidence of the sexual exploitation. But one thing that is not talked about is the sexual exploitation that happened to the black men on these plantations.
The whole European expansion, that was a homosexual enterprise. The Victorian expansion, British expansion, most of those colonels were homosexuals. In fact, in a very important book, Homosexuality and Colonization, it's documented that European colonies were all seen as homosexual playgrounds.
Part of the whole buck-breaking process was the emasculation of the male slave. And so they would take probably the strongest, most resilient, most resistant, most outspoken of the enslaved to make an example of him in front of everyone else. And part of making that example of him was to go through a process of complete and total humiliation, which included public flogging, which included actual rape.
As men, they would actually tie our hands down, spread our hands, spread our legs, and they would physically rape us. Slave masters would rape black men in front of his entire family, sometimes in front of the whole plantation. They bring them all out. The bigger the black man, the stronger the black man, the more they would rape him, the more they would buck him, just to make sure that none of them would be inspired to do anything to fight back.
There's a lot of evidence of the white slave owners who were practicing sodomy against the black males. You had people like Thomas Thistlewood in Jamaica who talked about some of the black men who were sodomized out there.
It comes with an admission on both sides. You know, the black man doesn't really want to admit that he was in such a weakened state that he was able to be, you know, buck broken by the slave master.
During antebellum slavery, around that time, homosexuality was still illegal, but you had a lot of white men who would practice it, especially on the enslaved people that they had on their plantations. And they would also have relations with each other that was very covert, and a lot of people didn't know about it. There was one white slave owner, James Hammond. He had diaries that are infamous, and there's a book about his diaries and his life where he sent a letter to another slave owner, Thomas Withers, and they were having a gay relationship with each other. And Hammond was a known pedophile at the time. He molested some of his own nieces. So we know some of the things that he was doing to the black people, especially the black men on those plantations.
It was continually a process of making sure that there was no energy to do anything against me. You're not going to want to fight me. Why? Because I just destroyed your champion. I just destroyed your man. I just destroyed your father, your brother, your uncle, your grandfather. I destroyed him. And he's your protector because you are consciously and culturally imbued with the idea that the man is the protector and the provider. So if I destroy your protector and your provider, you will become my slave by default.
The white LGBT community, they've always had an anti-black sector of their society that has always negatively targeted black people. Lord Cornbury, going back into antebellum slavery, Cornbury was one of the first governors of the province of New York and New Jersey. He was a transgender. This was a person who dressed like a woman. And also, this was the person who helped expand slavery in the United States against black people.
The process of feminizing the native culture was to sodomize the male, because the white man has this sick paradigm that the only homosexual is the one who's being sodomized, but the sodomizer retains his masculinity.
There's a sickness that they act like if you're not the receiver, that it's not gay or some shit like that. But listen, if your dick is getting hard for another man, you gay. Even if you're just thinking about it, you don't even have to do the act. Like, if you think about it and you get that little twinge, oh, you gay, motherfucker. Like, make no mistake about it.
They had whole farms. They had bug-breaking farms on multiple areas. Jamaica is one. They had them in different other islands all throughout America, of course, where they would make sure, and a buck, so we can understand, is a male horse. You know, you're dealing with male animals, particularly a buck, male deer, etc. But they refer to us as a buck because we are like an animal, a horse. Put us in stables. They would actually take the horses out of the stables, put black men in the stables, and then bring women into each stable just so we can have sex with them and get them pregnant for a number of purposes to create more slaves.
I got some young men on the stand, and I'm using man loosely because that's a status. How do you support yourself, young man? Yo, Yana, with due respect, I got 4 ladies take care of me. They give me anything I want. They think I need. I got 2 of them with good JOBs. One get a crazy check, the other one get ALDC. They takes care of me. See, well, what about what you do? Well, I smooth them out. What do you do? Well, that's what I do. That just sounds like gigolo action, but see, you've been programmed to think that way. You're like a slave on a plantation. The buck who gets rewarded for knocking up all of the fillies on the plantation so master can have larger herds of livestock.
I literally have a branch of my family where the men, you know, you put someone's testicles on the scale to see how big they are, and you let that guy be a breeder and give him a silver dollar for every child each time a woman gets pregnant. Whereas I can get the unlimited sex being, I guess, sort of fun, if that man had any connection to any one of those women or any of those children that would come from a union, he has to depersonalize that because it's work.
But more than that, we were also, we couldn't be men, right? And that dynamic in and of itself became a problem. We were perceived as cattle. We had gender, we had male and female, but we couldn't be men and women. Those came with legal rights. Those came with, with options in the society to express yourself. You could vote, you could buy property, you could move where you wanted to willingly. That was not something we were able to do. So this removal of man and woman, this removal of the categories of gender, dehumanized us by letter of law.
There's one very familiar story of an enslaved African woman who says that she is married to an enslaved African man. And as she is married to him, she tells the story of him climbing in her bed. And she's prepared for him. She kicks him out of the bed. And as he attempts to get back in the bed, she grabs the poker and slams it into his head. Often that story of this man whose name is Rufus is told as if he is a sexual exploiter, as if he's a rapist. But we need to think more deeply about how the system controlled black sexuality, how it undermined black womanhood, and even really undermined black manhood. He did not marry her out of choice. This was part of the crude slave breeding system. He was being forced to engage in relationships with this woman.
At one point, there were documents where the U.S. government took audio recordings during the 1930s and the 1940s of black people who were former slaves. And a lot of them recalled during slavery, they were degendered to a certain degree, meaning that their individual sexuality was not recognized. The black boys and girls were all treated interchangeably. And a lot of the black males, when they were children, they said that they had to wear dresses. They would put everybody in dresses. And that was a way to degender and to dehumanize a group of people. If you don't look at them as a gender or what their gender is, and you just make them interchangeable, you can dehumanize them to a certain degree. And that was a very common thing during slavery, the degendering of black people.
From what I've read, like the workloads were the same. Like we had to still do the same thing regardless if I was a woman, if I was pregnant, or whatever the case may be. I still had to do the same thing. Like the work was still required if we were out in the field, you know. So the only times my sexuality or my femininity would be acknowledged would be to fulfill the lust of the slave master. So that's what we become to base femininity to, is sex, because that's the only time we were able to show any type of femininity.
Peter Sawali was another black man who was buck-broken during the antebellum slavery time period. He was up in New York, and he was a black man who would cross-dress, put on women's clothing, women's wigs, and he would prostitute himself, and he would also get white males and take them in alleys and finesse them and pickpocket them. And he went to trial out there. There was another infamous case with him. A lot of his victims didn't want to come forward because they were embarrassed to find out that the person who finessed them and robbed them was a black man pretending to be a woman. The media at the time gave him the nickname Beefsteak Pete because he had male genitalia and he was pretending to be a woman.
The whitenized version of Christianity that they had been taught, and incidentally, religion was used as a process of buck breaking because it was used to basically make us more docile and more submissive. They would basically cherry pick scriptures and feed them to you. They would create a slave Bible that took out any references to justice and to freedom. And they would have these preachers go and preach messages about slaves being obedient to your masters, obeying masters. That's how Nat Turner started out.
If you go to the Bible Museum that's not far from here, they used to have the slave Bibles. Black folks were taught that they needed to be broken and slaves to white people. They had the little perverse Bible. The fundamentals of them allowing blacks to go to church in America is accepting whatever bad happened to them as God's will.
The speech given by Sojourner Truth, "Ain't I a Woman?" that was based on the degendering of the black man and the black woman. She talked about how she had to do the same type of work as a man. Ain't I a woman? I got to go out here and pick the cotton like a man. Ain't I a woman? Because she was responding to the white feminists talking about women's rights. So she was being critical of the white feminist movement. But the white feminist movement, they've taken that ain't I a woman speech and flipped that as if she was talking for women's rights. And Sojourner Truth was talking about the rights of all black people, and she was talking against the ungendering of black people.
White supremacy is a mom and pop operation. A white mom and a white pop kick the rest of us in the ass. They steal our labor. They've exploited us, and they do it together. Now, how they get along once they get the proceeds in the big house, sipping mint juleps and having affairs and all, that's a different issue of how they fight each other. But ultimately, white lesbian feminism and white male supremacy are two wings on the same bird.
At some point, you had just as many white female slave masters as white male slave masters, and they were just as brutal as them. You know, some of the males on the plantations, they were raped by white female masters. And I know some people might think that that's odd to hear that a man got raped. But, you know, it was unconsensual sex, so it was rape. And so that's a part of buck breaking as well.
Right now, we are in the French Quarters area of New Orleans, and we are right in front of the Madame Lillerie mansion. Madame Lillerie was a very infamous slave owner who was known for torturing the enslaved foundational black Americans right in this very mansion. She was known to chain some of the enslaved people to stoves and starve them for weeks on end. She would keep enslaved people in cages and do all of these crude experiments on them. There was one situation where one of the enslaved people had their bones broken and then reconfigured to that of a crab, so the person looked like a human crab. This woman also conducted crude sex change operations on the enslaved foundational black Americans here. Her torturous ways became so brutal. There was a very young black girl who was enslaved in this mansion. She tried to escape Madame Lillerie, and this little girl jumped out of that top window behind us and killed herself.
men could be the victims of rape as well. And it was a lot that happens. And even with like some of these white women, you know, they like to put on this trope that black men were just these savages, these brutes who couldn't keep their hands off of them, when it was the opposite. They were so much attracted to our men, and the men were not able to turn them down and refuse them, you know. So it goes both ways. We were both basically objectified to the point where masculinity and femininity at its core is just sex at this point.
After the black girl jumped out of that window, the city of New Orleans and the people found out about the crimes and the horrific torture chambers that were going on in this house, and they ended up running Madame LaLaurie out of New Orleans. Now, you have to be extremely horrific that white people would run a slave owner out of the city because of the cruelty to the enslaved black people. But this mansion, people still say this is one of the most haunted houses in New Orleans, and many people for years did not want to own this mansion.
Feminism wouldn't exist were it not for black men. Okay, Frederick Douglass, Martin Delany, it was black men who were angry that their mothers were raped by the master, beat by the master, separated from their kids. It was black men who were demanding fair treatment for women. And they gave power to those old white lesbians and the horses and buggies and so forth, because the raping continues in the new plantations. Child and Family Services, public schools, the weaponized, depraved black church. Yeah, I said it just like that. And prisons. The raping of black men continues, or for that matter, the music business. Or the military. I mean, most people aren't aware Jeffrey Dahmer was raping black men long before he got an honorable discharge raping black men in the U.S. military.
This is the reason why you could draw a straight line from the image of the buck coming from the antebellum propaganda directly to images that you see on television today. That you can draw a straight line between the idea of the Jezebel and images you see today. The images aren't different, they've just been updated.
When black people got off the plantations after formal slavery in America, the buck-breaking did not end there. In fact, the buck-breaking techniques became more systemic, and they took on more violent forms, entering into the Jim Crow era.
The perception of black men in the dynamic of the plantation family, because the plantation was seen as a family. The white man was considered the father, the white woman the mother, and the enslaved were considered their children. The image of black men at that time was that we were grown children. We were to be raised, by this white family structure. The notion of the dangerous and rapist-oriented black male really doesn't gain traction until really the early part of the 20th century and middle part of the 20th century. But earlier on, there was this idea that we were feminized, we were less masculine, we were weak, we were childlike.
For a lot of us, prior to the work of Ida B. Wells, believed that black men were lynched because of they were sexual predators. But give thanks to Ida B. Wells' work, she found out that most of these men were lynched because they were black business owners. They were lynched because of economic envy. They were competing with white people economically.
And their castrating of us was the final blow all the way. That's the apex, that's the climax of that orgasmic feeling. Not only do I get pleasure out of removing his power, but by me castrating and removing his procreative organ, I actually now know that, guess what? If his is gone, mine is the only one left. So if his power is gone, his ability to be an individual, a man, a ruler, a king is completely gone. I have dethroned him. I have removed him from his godhood. I removed him from his nature. Now I'm the only one that exists. By default, I become the ruler. I'm the king. I am the power source. I'm the protector and the provider. I'm the master.
There's a reason 80% of the lynched victims were not just males, young black males. It derives from the Paracelsian corpse phenomenon of Europe. What's a Paracelsian corpse? the Christians of Europe had this theology, and this undergirds the phenomenon of lynching in America. The church had this theology that every human life, that the lifespan was an energy, and every human life is endowed with a set amount of this spiritual energy. If a human dies prematurely, he dies before he or she, but largely he, can spend all of his spiritual energy. The excess, the remaining spiritual energy can be harvested. And they said that that if a young male in particular died an immediate violent death, that's the best course to harvest the spiritual energy. They call this a Paracelsian course.
There are stories of people who still have jars containing the genitalia of black men. There are stories of people who have the labia, which has been removed, of black women. We're going to hear more about this as we move forward.
As lynchings and castrations became commonplace, there were also symbolic castrations of black people as well, particularly when it came to cutting and controlling black hair.
Well, from our very first contact with European and Arab slave catchers and masters, they would see our most ornate hairstyles, and one of the first things that they did to their new human cargo was to shave their hair, so disconnecting them from African culture and the adornments.
The hair is the symbol of your essence. It is your essence that frightens them. That wearing that hair certain ways says that you are aware of your essence. You are aware of your strength. You are aware of your beingness. And he has done everything in his power to destroy your consciousness of yourself, to destroy your human beingness. And so when you see somebody come up with natural hairdo and sacred locks and dressing in traditional clothing, first thing he sees is that that's not my slave anymore. I must now be afraid of him because the crimes I've committed have been so atrocious. Anybody in their right mind is going to kill me when they find out about the crimes.
The symbolism behind anything dealing with removing our power, they had to cut off anything. So the penis, they cut that off because that would hang. The hair, they cut that off because that hangs. Everything dealing with power, it stretches toward the sun. It stretches out. It shows a level of extension or existence or prolonging of its existence. So they want to make sure we destroy that.
So I think that hair has always been used as a form of resistance, especially for African warriorhood. So whether we look at the Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania, in order for them to be warriors, they have to grow locks. And so you can tell how long a man has been a warrior based on the length of his hair.
I think that when you compare hair to virility, which is what people often think hair is, it's a connection to virility. I think that we should expect to see that European society has problems with black hair. This should be expected. Because we don't talk about it enough, we're not clear about its manifestations. It was just last year that New York City made it illegal to discriminate on workers based on wearing African hairstyles.
White people have had control over our bodies. They've been able to control where we go, what we do, even what we do sexually, of course. But in this day and age, the slavery is not so much physical as it is mental, you know? So by telling us that having locks or having our hair in an afro or in its natural state is unprofessional, this is now a mental slavery that is taking place.
There have been so many laws in the United States that actually regulate black women's hair and appearance. So even like the Tignon laws in Louisiana, where it was actually illegal for black women to show their hair in public. Some say because the hair was seen as so ugly and unattractive that it needed to be covered up, but most say it was a way to prevent white men from being attracted to the beauty of black women. But considering that black women had to wear head wraps, and we could create the most Erykah Badu style, that it was still attracting white men's attention. And white women could not mimic that head wrap style. And so that it actually became a threat because the white men were more interested in the black women in Louisiana than the white women.
Out here in Louisiana, during slavery, on plantations just like this, you know, the French was dominating this area. And whenever there were black people who ran away from the plantations, they would get branded. And the brand would be a logo of the French heraldry. It's the fleur de lis. And they would get branded on their shoulder, or they would get branded on their cheek with this fleur de lis logo. And what's interesting about this logo, now today, this same logo is the logo for the New Orleans Saints football team. So a football team dominated by black people playing today, are walking around with logos of runaway slaves.
And it's so ironic that so much of the brutality meted out against African men, against black men, is supposedly because we are lusting for white women, something that we have no record of happening whatsoever.
In the Caucasian culture, they have this sadistic type of mentality when it comes to sex where the more depraved, the more nasty, the more disgusting, the more immoral you can get, the more enticing and attractive it is. They even choke themselves while they're masturbating, while they're being, involving themselves in sex, because they believe that that increases the strength of the orgasm. So that symbolically is something that they were looking at when they were lynching black men. They would lynch us because that choking is something so they could see his power leaving his body, but they would get somewhat of this erotic type of orgasmic feeling about it.
When we talk about the white LGBT community trying to make comparisons to their struggle and black struggle, the white LGBT community, they've never had a comparative struggle. In fact, their whiteness has always saved them, whereas the black LGBT people, they've always been punished. So there has never been a comparative struggle.
As an LGBT person or whatever the letters are, like, I don't have to know that about you. Like, you don't have to wear your sexuality on your sleeve, but there's no way that you can avoid seeing that I'm an original man.
The dominant society is backing your movement, then you're not really oppressed. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't make sense. Like, if I'm truly oppressed and I need freedom and help so that I'm no longer disenfranchised, the people who are oppressing me are not going to promote my freedom. They're not going to help me to get it. You know what I'm saying? So the fact that this is being pushed and there's so much money and funding into it everywhere lets us know that you're really not honestly oppressed.
During the colonization of not just here in America, but over in Africa, you had colonizers like Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was LGBT. A lot of folks don't know that he was a closeted LGBT, and he was doing certain things to the people over there.
The Nazis, they were pederasts. Hitler and all his crew. Yeah, there's a documentary or a book called Pink Swastika. Check it out. It's all about the pederasty and the whole Hitler Youth and all of that. That's where they were getting them from and all of that. And all Ava Braun and all of those were just beards.
Robert Baden-Powell, who was an officer with the British Army, he was over in Africa fighting with a lot of the Aboriginal people there and dominating and conquering and colonizing them. Well, he was a closeted white LGBT, and in fact, he was the person who started the Boy Scouts. And the Boy Scouts were put together to be a white supremacist nationalist organization to teach white boys about the importance of white nationalism. In fact, the Boy Scouts influenced Hitler's youth.
So if you're controlling the media and you're displaying black males in an effeminate manner, it's still showing the dominance and the power of European men. Think about this. I can make him put on a dress. And that's what they do. Did you notice in Hollywood, it seems like you can't get to the next level unless you put on a dress.
There was a scene where I read, and I was worried about coming into work because they had us in these dresses. I think they're called burqas or something like that. And I went straight to the director and I was like, yo, man, I'm not trying to mess up y'all's shot, but I'm not putting that on. And, they were like, oh, Corey, it's just a joke. I'm like, well, I don't joke like that. I can't put on a dress because this is TV. And a lot of people who pay to come see me are counting on me, and I'm counting on me.
When people talk about black people in America and our struggle being comparative to the struggle of people in the LGBT community, nothing could be farther from the truth, because a lot of people in the white LGBT community was practicing the same anti-black racism that we suffered in this country. And no person exemplifies that more than J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover, who was a white LGBT man, waged war on black society. J. Edgar Hoover made it his mission to destroy any black messiah or any progressive black organization.
Robert Park, a famous sociologist from the University of Chicago, died in 1944. He authored the concept of the Negro as the lady of the races. He said the Anglo-Saxon people were the man of the races, pioneering, industrious. He said the Negro people were the lady of the races. They are polite, right? They don't want to offend anybody. They are more inclined to the arts and expressiveness.
Roy Cohn was an infamous white LGBT lawyer during the Jim Crow era and going into the 70s. He was a part of the McCarthy trials, where they were targeting black men like Paul Robeson, calling them communists because of their views. He also sued Dr. Martin Luther King for libel. So when people try to talk about the white LGBT's community's struggle is comparative to the black struggle, they were some of the ones antagonizing and targeting black people like Dr. King, Paul Robeson. Also, Roy Cohn was the lawyer for Donald Trump when Donald Trump was being sued for discriminating against black people in the early 70s.
But yeah, it's nothing like being black in America. Like, I don't remember all these, gay people being put into slavery and, being lynched and, you know what I mean? Like, I'm sure there's anecdotal stories of shit happening like that. I'm talking to the disproportionate degree that it happened to us.
On one hand, they stand on a soapbox and say, black men are missing in the lives of their children, and they're missing in the home, and the reason we have so much crime among black men is because of the absence of black male role models. But then on the other hand, when black men stand up as men, then they say that we're toxic and we're detrimental to society. You can't have it both ways.
So Jim Jones up there in San Francisco, he was a white LGBT cult leader. A lot of folks don't know that he was bisexual, so he was having sex with some of those black men that were following him. But he was up there in San Francisco. He became a cult leader. Many of his congregation, they were black people, poor black people up there in San Francisco. He was running like a finesse scheme where he would get black people to give him their welfare checks. So black people were looking at him as a white Jesus type of figure. So he finessed everybody to go down there to Guyana. Eventually, he got people to do a mass suicide. About 900 to 1,000 black people died in one day. And some people say that that might have been some kind of covert government operation.
Every negative in society, they're trying to put a black face to it. So whether it is pedophilia, regardless of the facts that most pedophiles are white males, they will highlight black men and put a black face to it. When you talk about homophobia, the reality is you can't get any more so-called homophobic than white evangelical Christians, but yet and still, they try to put a black face on it. They want to blame the black church, they want to blame black men, they want to put a black face to everything. And the reality is, there has been no one who has been more tolerant and supportive of homosexuals than black people.
After inflicting horrendous buck-breaking atrocities on black people during the slavery and the early Jim Crow era, white supremacist society began to refine their tactics, and different sectors of the dominant society began to co-opt the suffering that they inflicted on black people in order to push their own agendas.
Whenever we try to superimpose someone's struggle upon the black struggle, virtually everyone does it, we are actually devaluing what Africans did, and we are actually stealing what Africans are able to do by saying that all of these stories are the same.
Black men set the styles for all young men all over the world, because that's why hip-hop, gangster, thug, rap, and rap video sell so well around the world, and also why it's so stagnant. It has not changed in 30 years. Why? Because those who put the money behind it, for the most part, sell a lot of it in Japan, Sydney, Berlin, Paris, Rome, London, Liverpool. And Japanese guys don't know how to dance. They just jump up and down, you know, with that offbeat stuff. And they are familiar with the current rap genre, so they don't want to change. Now, why are they interested? Because, like everybody in the industrialized world, there is this LGBTQ influence that has attempted to emasculate them. So when they see the hip-hop, gangster, thug, rap video, there is all of this masculine imagery that they identify with. So what black youth set is the image all of the world's youth pick up.
So I thought it was utterly ridiculous that we joined in the feminist movement. And because our issue is not just, yes, sexism exists, we get that. But with African women, we're dealing with racism, classism, and then we can talk about sexism, right? And so our priorities, we should prioritize race, class, and then gender, not gender and then everything else. And I feel like with the feminist movement, they prioritize gender, not so much race and class.
Gender feminism was the segue from regular feminism that was supposed to be for the rights of women, equal pay, and so forth, which you call suffragette feminism. But when Amazonian feminism came into play, that would be gender feminism, that's what they called it. When gender feminism came into play, that became a more radical type of feminism that was to attack every sanctified structure of a community.
The white feminist movement has not worked for black women. It's not for us. I will never call myself a feminist because it's a trap. Like, if we look at it historically, the only reason why white women have ever included us in was to pad their numbers and to destroy whatever we had going on. If you look back to the women's suffrage movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they didn't care anything about black women. The only reason why they wanted to make sure they got the right to vote because black men may have potentially had the right before them. And they were quoted saying that black men, as vile as they are, they're not worthy of the vote.
White evangelicalism is nothing but white supremacy in drag. White feminism is nothing but white supremacy in heels. And so many of our sisters have joined with white feminists to try to emasculate black men. And so we have to be able to stand up boldly and strongly and say, listen, I'm a man, and I'm going to stand in my maleness and in my manhood, regardless of what society has to say about it.
And we are fighting against oppression, and then here come white women saying, oh, I'm oppressed too. I'm a woman, I'm oppressed. And then they pull black women out of the civil rights movement and turn us against our own men, and we're seeing it happening now. Everybody was protesting Black lives, and then here come white women say, me too.
The racist Caucasians start attacking the woman, telling her she was lazy, telling her that she got bad people around her. It's this movie Claudine. I just really think people should watch it because it shows you how they used to, things that they do to the black men now, that's what they used to do to the sisters. They used to tell her something was wrong with her, but they switched it up. Now they're saying something is wrong with the man, and they're turning the sisters against the man in every way. So their power with the media and things like that is real.
They pump up the women, but it's a trick. Because on one hand, they'll say how great the black woman is, but they'll say, well, she's fat. She can't keep a man. She's not a good mother. And she's the bottom of the barrel, even though she's so strong. So what they give, they're taking away at the same time.
what we've seen, especially in the last few months, are these magazine covers that have been coming out, Time.com, so on and so forth, that are championing the image of the black woman, lone survivor, lone, kind of hero. She's the moral center of the movement, the sacrificial lamb, so to speak, and black men end up kind of falling into the background if they're there at all. This is not an accident. This agenda, again, goes back to this idea that black men really have no place, we have no significance, and our job is to follow the path that we're given, one by white society, but as filtered through black women.
There's a lot of people who say, like, I should understand intersectional feminism because I'm a black woman. But I honestly believe that intersectionality is a scapegoat. I could say that I'm a feminist, and by that way, I'm able to absolve myself of my blackness, and I could put this fact that I'm woman before that. And the fact that I'm black comes before all of that. It comes before the fact that I'm a woman, sexual orientation, religion, whatever different things that people have going on. The fact that I'm black comes before all of that, So I think that in the 60s, there was more choice. You had the ability to step away from that and into something else. Back during the times of slavery, there was no choice. You couldn't step away from your blackness. You were reminded of it every day, and there was no other thing that you could run and hide behind and call yourself feminist over calling yourself a black woman.
They take all of these dead black males, young black men, and they convert them to a bait and switch thing to support black lesbianism and the destruction of the black families.
Feminism became the battering ram that broke in or crashed in the doors of Congress and opened the way for homosexual rights.
Well, after Nate Parker's Birth of a Nation came out, which I thought was an excellent film, one of the things I saw was a push by black feminists to remove Nat Turner's name from his own rebellion and suggest that it should just be everyone that lived in the area. It should just be named after the area as opposed to honoring Nat Turner. So this idea that, well, we like the sacrifice, we like the rebellion, but we just have to remove this black male face from it.
They did the same thing with Nat Turner. They tried, they put the bone out that he was involved. I think it was called Confessions of Nat Turner. It was a white dude that went to, the prison right before he was hung, and he claims that Nat Turner confessed to having same-sex relationships. But this is about population control. We have to understand that. It's about population control, and it's also about destroying the oldest institution in the world, and that's the black family. Black families are essential to building a black nation. And so if you want to destroy a nation, well, we had to destroy the family. How do we destroy the family? Well, we put a wedge between the fundamental building blocks of a family, and that's the black man and black woman.
So the white LGBT community, they used the incident at Stonewall Inn in New York to create a lot of myths and misconceptions about what happened there. And they've used that, the myths of what happened there, as a part of their civil rights history. The Stonewall Inn was a gay club in New York in 1969. In the 1960s in New York, there were a lot of gay clubs. The police just kind of looked the other way. The mafia was controlling these clubs, and the mafia had a lot of criminal activity going on in these clubs. The police knew about it, and the police were corrupt. They would get paid off to look the other way. Now, sometimes when the police wouldn't get their payoffs, they would raid places. And the Stonewall Inn was one of those places. There was a lot of illegal activity in there. That's why it got raided. It didn't get raided because there were gay people in there. That's a lie that they like to tell. That is not why it got raided. It got raided because of the criminal activity. What happened was there happened to be black people at that particular club partying with the white LGBT people. The black people began to get beaten by the police. They fought the police, and that's what the Stonewall riot was. It was a lot of the black people fighting the police up there in New York. The white LGBT community, they flipped that into them getting abused because of their sexuality. They even made a movie where the main character was a white man, and the white man didn't even exist. So there were a lot of lies about the Stonewall Inn.
The police were shaking these people up for money, and they fought back. And many of those people were black and Puerto Rican.
They're changing the history, not only when it comes to the people, the movements, but also the sexual orientation of the people in the movements. Brother Malcolm X, for example, I heard this narrative from some new documentary that came out, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, I believe was the name of the documentary. Manning Marable, who was the primary individual who was a part of that, who wrote a book that took nearly 20 years to write, is the primary person, and there were others, who came up with this narrative that Brother Malcolm was gay.
They're also, not only have they taken our labor or our music, they're also taking our legacy. So, they want to make all our leaders gay. I saw a book in the Library of Congress that's saying Benjamin Banneker is gay. So I guess maybe he made a dildo along with the clocks and stuff. We just don't know that. We'll find out one day. We'll find these papers right.
Our brother Fred Hampton, Black Panther leader out of Chicago, he was the person who had something called the Rainbow Coalition. That was the Black Panthers working with different groups to have a coalition and to have an allyship in order to fight against injustice. After our brother was assassinated by the government and the COINTELPRO program that LGBT J. Edgar Hoover put together, that Rainbow Coalition got co-opted by some of the older civil rights people like Jesse Jackson. He had the Rainbow Coalition, and then the white LGBT community got a hold of that Rainbow Coalition and rode the coattails of that.
Yeah, they took that word, essentially rainbow meaning all different colors. You have to see what colors, that's the difference. Now they began to co-opt that, the LGBT community, or the gay community, I'm just going to call it that, you're going to just factor it down to the gay community. They took the rainbow color as their own when Jesse Jackson's whole Rainbow Coalition came up on an investigation anyway.
See, one of their problems is they're homosexual, same sex. See, it used to be the male gender and the female gender had sex together, but when it was male on male or female on female, that was bad. But see, they've taken that word gender over the last 20 years, 25 years, and they have converted it so now there is one long spectrum with 58 genders on it. So that gets rid of the onus of same sex if there's only one sex.
There was an incident that happened in 1977 with Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor did a charity event, I think it was a charity event in Hollywood at the Hollywood Bowl, and it was a white LGBT event. And Richard, I don't think he knew the crux of what was going on with it, but when he went up there to do his routine, he kind of snapped on the audience. He cursed the audience out because he felt like the white LGBT community was using him, because he pointed out that they were talking about justice for them, the white LGBT community, and they were trying to compare their struggle with black struggles. But some of the people who were performing, who were black at that same event, they were being discriminated against, and Richard Pryor didn't like it. So he went out there and just cussed the whole audience out. He was telling them, if you're talking about justice, where were all you people during the Watch riots, which happened just a decade before that event? So he called them out, and it was a very infamous incident where he cussed that white LGBT audience out.
In the school system, you see that any boys who show hypermasculinity, what they will call, or toxic masculinity, what they will call, which is like boys being rambunctious, being themselves, showing agency for themselves, get punished, they get sent out of class. They are hard to control, per white teachers, especially by white females. These little boys are seen as threats. And so I believe that there's a concerted effort to reward boys for being less masculine or less dominant in the school environment.
Black boys are definitely targeted and marginalized more than black girls. I've experienced it. I remember being in school and coming into class and then seeing some of my black male classmates come in and the teacher's like, go to detention, I don't even want to deal with you today. And it's like the class hasn't even started yet.
In the New York City Department of Education, if a child reports to a teacher that they have changed their gender or identity or their orientation or their name and they want to change their pronouns. Let's say if a child, if Sarah grows up and by the time she gets in the 3rd grade, she says, hey, I'm not Sarah anymore. I'm not a girl. I'm a boy, so you can call me Johnny, right? Use the pronouns he, him, and his. For me, my name is Johnny. Do not call me Sarah. I am not a girl. Now, it is policy. If you look at the policies, it is actual policy that the teachers and adults in the school have to honor that child's choices.
As a part of that, you had someone by the name of David Thorstad, who was the founder of NAMBLA. So you had NAMBLA, gay rights, all coming together. The founder of the gay rights movement used to wear a shirt that on the front, he said gay rights for all, equal rights, etc. And on the back, it said NAMBLA walks with me. So he even endorsed NAMBLA, which was the North American Man-Boy Love Association, which is men who love boys. They had a combination and a joint movement with the gay rights movement.
If someone says, I am transgender, my name is John, whatever you think their gender identity is or their pronouns should be, you better use their correct pronouns. You better refer to that child by the pronouns that they said that they want, or you could lose your job, or someone could possibly sue you for bullying, harassment, and the equivalence of like a hate crime.
Now, the body develops before the mind does. So the body starts to develop, the mind isn't even there yet. Why are we introducing these complex ideas that the body isn't even going to catch up to for the next few decades, maybe the next couple decades, you know? So in my opinion, it helps to just add more confusion, because not only do children have to think about being children in their schoolwork, but now there's this added factor of sexuality, which is something that they've never really had to think about. It's something that was not even triggered yet in them. Their body is not even at a place where they should be on that topic.
Because if you really look at it, the basis of the civil rights movement was the church. But the basis of the church was the black family. And the only way you could dismantle an ongoing movement like that is to dismantle the family structure, right? So once that family structure is dismantled, you don't really see a significant protest movement in the black community until, I should say the last one I saw after the civil rights movement was probably the South African anti-apartheid. And then from there, 2015 rise of Hands Up, Don't Shoot, which evolves into BLM and the agenda you're talking about. That break is significant. It speaks to the breaking down of the black family, the disruption of any kind of gender norm, and from there, everything is everything. By the time you get to BLM, there is no nuclear family structure. Men are not really important unless we're dying and being used for other people's political advancement. And from there, black men end up having to chart their own path in a way we never had to before.
Well, we see a paradigm shift now, where we see a young group of activists that are neither tied to the church nor affiliated with the NAACP or any other civil rights organization, because we have abdicated our responsibility. And far too many church leaders are more concerned with being able to curry favor with white America. They don't want to be viewed as being rabble-rousers or bomb throwers or troublemakers. They don't want to jeopardize certain grants and resources that they may be receiving.
In the 90s, the whole barrage, whole propaganda, black people are homophobic, that was part of an effort to make the black community and black culture gay-friendly, en route to totally homosexualizing the black community.
When you talk about the church, which is supposed to be the face of this homophobia, well, the face of the church is the pastor, right? So the way I kind of always viewed that, this notion that black folk were homophobic was really a dig at really heterosexual black men in positions of leadership and how they are the bastions of homophobia. And so the idea from there becomes the leadership should transition to those who are more accepting. And those who are more accepting is everybody but black men.
As black America moved from the civil rights movement after we had made certain gains, after the Voting Rights Act, after the Civil Rights Act was passed, after the Fair Housing Act was passed, after we began to desegregate our schools and black people were now able to move into certain neighborhoods and go to certain schools, the church's focus shifted. All of a sudden, instead of dealing with civil rights and human rights, they started focusing on economics, which is a good thing in its place. But they started with a health and wealth doctrine, with a name it and claim it, with a prosperity gospel. And the church went off on a tangent so far away from its roots, it's having a difficult time getting back.
Black folks could be side pieces and bed wenches to various white homosexual male and lesbian females in these movements as well as within the Communist Party. So a lot of these far left circles, a way to integrate, a way to get access to the white things in life was to be sexually available, even on the other side of the bed.
If a man's value, if a man wants to be with a woman, right, what he may think or describe as a natural woman, and chooses not to have sex with, kiss, interact with, or date a transgender person, a transgender woman, then I'm seeing brothers in particular being gaslighted for, oh, you are a homophobe because you wouldn't date or have sex with or kiss this transgender person.
So once the government, through its scientists, declared that black masculinity was a sickness, it was to be medicated, and that black masculinity is the disease, black femininity is the cure.
If you take that combination, where especially if you got a man who brought up under his mother's tutelage, and that doesn't mean it's bad, but if you have men that haven't been brought up around men, that rite of passage type of thing has never happened, you're gonna see a lot of bitch ass niggas. And you're gonna see a whole bunch of bitches.
In the late 70s, there was a book by an unknown black female author named Michelle Wallace that was heavily promoted by white society called Black Macho. This book was the beginning of the white-funded black male-bashing black gender war wave that took off in the 80s. The main person pushing this book was a CIA-affiliated white feminist named Gloria Steinem.
So she kind of really objectified and dehumanized black men in a particular way, but it was a way that was popular, that people gravitated toward it. And I often say from that to Oprah, right? Oprah becomes a spigot, so to speak, a faucet that opens that up because she introduces these fairly obscure black feminist talking points to the mainstream. And then from there, it's being digested. So now you have women who will not call themselves feminists, who have never read a feminist book, but have feminist talking points because they're coming out of that mainstream culture that really starts with Indashake and Williams and filters through Oprah. And so that dynamic creates this snowball of black feminism that we're still seeing that's rooted in what we call an anti-black misandry, a hatred really of black men.
Gloria Steinem worked for the CIA while she was in college. She was recruited in college. And she was outed by a feminist group called Red Stockings. Red Stockings blew the lid off of that in the Village Voice.
But even things like birth control became an issue. Because at the end of the day, even now, men still have the same options we really had in the 50s. Condoms, abstinence, you know what I mean? Women had over 5 different forms of birth control and 30 different, manifestations, and that didn't even include abortion. So she had complete control of her body and her reproductive system and could actually terminate a pregnancy before, during, or after the Sex Act. We're still talking about pulling out. You know what I mean? That alone kind of offset things, and then we have to also look at the impact of no-fault divorce. So if just having sex means that she has complete control of the reproductive process, and family court means that whatever the court determines you have to pay, whether you can afford it or not, is imposed upon you by this, this apparatus, this court apparatus. All of those kind of things position black men into a very vulnerable state. And it left black men with really one option, and that was a silent protest. And that silent protest was to step back from formal marriage and begin to actually engage in, non-formal kinds of relationships, because there were very few other avenues.
Bayard Rustin clearly, and this has come out as a CIA asset, spied on and worked against the black movement. And before he died, he was one of the people that claimed the gay movement was the real movement of the time. So he's absolutely not our guy. We don't need him.
The film Color Purple, that becomes a landmark text, so to speak, for black men and how to see black men. And somehow, Danny Glover represents all black men. And from there, that is worse than slavery, retroactively speaking. So fiction begins to redefine history.
And they say, why don't you be more like Dr. King? And I always remind them, why would you want me to be more like Dr. King? You put dogs on him. You sprayed him with water hoses. You put him in jail, and eventually you murdered him. So at the end of the day, whether our resistance is nonviolent resistance like a Dr. King or like a Colin Kaepernick, or whether it is more aggressive combative resistance, the end result is always the same. White supremacy is always going to try to quell black resistance in any way possible.
The white supremacist elite are becoming more sophisticated with their buck-breaking techniques. They're now using more propaganda and media for their sinister agendas. And one way they use this propaganda is to normalize pedophilia.
First of all, if you are able to exploit someone's offspring, you are in complete control of those people. Because the one thing that human beings will do worldwide, regardless of where they live, regardless of what country they are in, what municipality they're in, what language they speak, what religion they practice, they will protect their children. So if you are able to exploit children, you have dominance over an entire society.
A lot of white aristocrats would have paintings of them with Moorish children who were indentured and enslaved to them. And they would dress these Moorish children up very elaborately, and they would kind of parade them around, and they would do these very expensive paintings with these black Moorish children. They would almost display them like they were pets. And they kind of do that today. You see a lot of white actors and people in Hollywood parading these little black adopted children around, and they dress them up like pets. Charlize Theron, she kind of does that with her black adopted children who were boys, then she turned into girls, so that's another story. But they would get these Moorish black children, and they would do these paintings with them, and the paintings would have a very pedophile type look to them. It was very disturbing to see these paintings with these Moorish children.
You know, what should be offensive is that, but it's probably very telling, is that there's a boys' town here in Chicago. Boys' town is a gay community here in Chicago, but what's telling is, I had to ask myself when I discovered it, why call it Boys Town?
They have made it so easily obvious now with people running for Congress, who are open pedophiles, people who are being ousted as pedophiles. They had a TED Talk recently in 2018 in Germany, I believe, where a young lady was promoting. She said, well, what is pedophilia? She said it's a normal feeling. Pedophilia is normal, just like any other sexual orientation. She said, we can't choose our feelings. It is what it is. We can simply choose how we act.
I saw actually recently one estimate that argues that 75% of the Nigerian immigrants in Europe are being used for sexual exploitation.
I mean, I remember going to Nigeria. This is the only time we've been in Africa, but we were out there for a week, and there was a young kid who lived in the village that we were staying in, and he would just come around every day, and like they like to hold your hand and stuff like that. Like African men will hold each other's hands and stuff like that, walking around. So he's this little kid, he's grabbing my hand, holding my hand, and then he's like, he comes to me one day and he's like, yo, I spoke to my mother and she said I can go to America with you. Now, I don't even have a child at this point, like, you know what I mean? And this kid is like 10. But it was just like, and it's not like his mother came to talk to me or anything, and he probably was dead ass serious. Because maybe she thought it was a better life or some shit. So now imagine a real white millionaire pulling up in his yacht or whatever, pulling off a private jet, talking about, I want to take your child for a better life. And they just, here you go.
Before Epstein Island, there was another white elitist pedophile ring off the coast of South Africa. It was reported that in the 1980s, high-ranking members of the white supremacist apartheid government were taking black boys to Bird Island to sexually abuse them. In 2018, a former officer with the South African government named Mark Minnie wrote a book exposing the Bird Island pedophile ring. Within 1 week of the book's release, Minnie was found dead and authorities ruled it a suicide, and all copies of the book was taken out of circulation.
Bird Island was the precursor to Epstein Island. So you might as well say that Bird Island and Epstein Island were pretty much sisters and brothers, or the Bird Island was the grandfather or grandmother of Epstein Island.
And when we look in South Africa, during the period where we see apartheid at its height, we see one of the ministers, I believe he was the Minister of the Interior, very high-ranking person, a man by the name of Magnus, actually being one of the individuals that was able to have this Bird Island, this pedophile island, as a place that his closest friends, other wealthy Boers, other wealthy Europeans in South Africa could go and have their way with South Africans. And I almost said South African girls, but you better be clear that there were South African boys there too.
These people actually marshaled military helicopters to take young boys over to the island under the pretext that they would be teaching them new skills, hunting, fishing, manhood training, and the whole 9 yards. Came to find out that when they got there, they were trapped on the island and they had to do all kind of perverse acts with these people who were part of P.W. Botha's upper echelon.
They go to Africa and to the Caribbean and to Asia because they know that the forces of the dominant culture will not attack them for that. They will attack them if it's European. But what was interesting is that in this case, Jeff Epstein used to take European girls and bring them to the Caribbean to become part of it. He took them to places that were outside the United States of America, along with the entire crew that was part of that.
We hear a lot less about the fact that he literally had a private island that many people called Pedophile Island. Many people called it Pedophile Island. This was no secret. But the reason why he was able to get away with it is because it was actually in the Caribbean. We've heard about young girls of European descent being taken there and raped, but I truly believe that we're going to hear more about people who live there who actually were also exploited. See, there's no value for black women and even less value for black girls. So when are we going to hear about the full story of what was happening there?
Jeffrey Epstein was an agent for Mossad. Jeffrey Epstein engaged in what used to be called love traps. His business was love traps for the Mossad, sexual blackmail. So that's why all of these politicians and European royalty were scrambling when he got arrested. And that's why, of course, he was suicidal. He was killed in prison.
Epstein died in very peculiar circumstances. He was being monitored every 45 minutes. He virtually had none of the things that you would need to have in order to commit suicide, yet peculiarly, he was able to commit suicide. I think we should be clear that there are many people who are afraid that he might try to cut a deal.
The minute you walk into Jeffrey Epstein's New York mansion, there's this huge painting of President Clinton in the blue Monica Lewinsky dress and red heels, sitting in a chair, giving you this look as if to say, what's done here stays here.
Even though high-ranking pedophile rings run by the white supremacist elite are being exposed, people should still be more aware of the pedophile propaganda that's trickling down into the lives of the general masses.
They do the same things with the drag queen reading hour, where grown men dress up as women and they read to little children in schools. One of these circumstances in Texas was by a Mexican male who dressed up as a female, who was a convicted child predator.
In a project designed to combat homonegativity in the black community, Johns Hopkins University doled out $400,000 to a project that assessed adolescent black boys' satisfaction with anal penetration.
They're teaching children all the way in middle school and in certain kindergarten schools how to have anal sex, having these adults teach this, and then showing them how to put on condoms and all that in preschool for some children doing these little demonstrations.
In California, a new bill was passed called SB 145, and many people have coined this the pedophile bill. This is because this law offers certain levels of protection to some pedophiles.
SB 145, you can be an 18 or 19-year-old boy and you can have sex with an 8-year-old boy as long as that 8-year-old boy feels that he is a girl or he has LGBT leanings.
We have to recognize that pedophiles actually prey on the powerless. And in most societies around the world, the most powerless are the Africans. Because of the remnants, because of the reality of the transatlantic enslavement trade and the continuing systems of white supremacy that are still working and are still alive and well. So that when we see people who are powerless, we're going to see ripe conditions for sexual abuse.
It's very important to understand the correlation between the buck-breaking techniques that were used during slavery and the scientific buck-breaking and social engineering and refined eugenics tactics that are being used on black people today.
Because a lot of black men, after slavery, they would have to work in the sex industry because they were providing sexual favors in slavery. So after slavery, a lot of them had to provide sexual favors and get into the sex work industry outside of slavery. And even today, a lot of black men who are LGBT, because they don't get any resources from the white LGBT community who uses them as mascots, they're reduced to working into the sex industry.
Black men and black people get a bum rap about being homophobic. You would think we killed Matthew Shepard. You would think a black guy shot up the Pulse nightclub down in Orlando. These are either white people or folks who are identified as honorary white that do this kind of stuff. The Jeffrey Dahmer, and there's this mass killer. Are you familiar with Ronald Dominique, white guy who's down in New Orleans and who's just killing black men, killed maybe 25 black men, would rape and kill them. You don't hear about it. And this, I'm certain this happens, like Ed Buckner. When these things happen, you can't kill black men and it matter. It's white homosexual man killing black men, that's not homophobic. A black man saying he wants his son to grow up straight like Kevin Hart, now he's a monster.
And there was a study done at UCLA to kind of assess just what size the black LGBT population was. And it came out to be roughly about 4%, right, of black America. And yet, out of that population, there was basically one black trans person killed per year, some years. For black men, but most particularly heterosexual black men, it was about 200 to 300 per year. And that's being conservative based on what's reported, right? But you can see the kind of stratification of the data, but notice that nobody presents the data.
That stuff in Chicago that's supposed to be black folks killing each other out on the streets, not really. That idiot Lightfoot, also a LGBTQer, she gave funds for community development directly to Hispanic street gangs. That really displeased legitimate Hispanic leadership. And what happens is they used it apparently to buy guns from the broken in boxcars that were filled with arms, armed up, supplied up, and Hispanic street gangs are killing black kids. So black street gangs are killing brown kids. So the media puts it out as black on black crime when actually what it is black on brown crime, brown on black crime.
1965, 1966, the same Johns Hopkins University, they secretly opened a sex change clinic. A clinic that performed sex change operations, but look, this is the kicker, Brother Tariq. The inaugural patient, the first one who was scientifically transgender, was a black male named Avon Wilson.
At one point, you know, they were trying to get brothers to wear skirts in hip hop. And I feel like I was on the forefront, if not single-handedly, may have stopped that shit from happening. Because I started calling motherfuckers out. I called out Kanye West. I called out all these dudes. Omar Epps. Anybody that was wearing skirts out here was like, nah, that ain't cool. And so that trend didn't pass. It came real quick, and then it's gone. They'll probably try to bring it back at some time, but not while I'm around.
White feminists looked upon poor black women as their role models because they say they're the only women in America who are not trapped in the slavery of marriage. So how do they handle their macho, super masculine black men? We need to use that as a model to handle white men. So if we start with them, we can make the process so that young white boys wanting to be hip will try to be like they see black men do. So if we get black men jacked around, self-depreciating with no respect and glorifying dysfunction, we can get the white boys to do the same thing.
Dr. Henry Kissinger, who promoted this in 1974, that homosexuality should be promoted as a strategy or as an advantageous lifestyle in black communities, as a way to go towards depopulation, that he quoted in his National Security Study Memorandum 200, where he stated, quote, depopulation should be the highest priority of U.S. foreign policy towards the third world, end quote. But he also meant that for it to be domestic and local.
But if you think about how much we reproduce and then how much trouble they have reproducing. Like, how many white couples do you know, oh, we're going to in vitro, we have to have shots and all this because we having trouble having a baby. So it's not just that we reproduce faster, stronger offspring, they have trouble reproducing.
So because we have so few black folk in the hood that are men, it's fairly easy to get to them and condition them to negativity. See, the thug, typical hood rat thug, is a lesbian in a boy's body. Lesbians and the hood rat are raised like girls.
Black America is under an estrogen assault through our food, through our water, through the air we breathe. Air in black zip codes is very different from air in white zip codes. It's a fact, a document.
I call it science of strategic extinction. It's the way that you deal with exterminating people or with a soft extermination. So you have to deal with either hard extermination, where you just come right out and start killing everybody and dealing with a complete pogrom, as they used to call it, or you essentially do soft eliminations. You deal with the food, you deal with the water, you deal with the air.
In eugenics, the major overall idea is to scientifically prove the inferiority of one gender, race, or population of a people, and to prove the superiority of another. So primarily this was dealing with the blonde hair, blue-eyed as superior. Everybody else is inferior. Number one, black. They did tests on rats. They did tests on babies. They did tests on children, grown men, etc. This is what justified the annihilation of people in Germany. This is what justified the annihilation of our brothers and sisters in the Congo, etc., etc., etc.
You could deal with eugenics by breaking down the different components of eugenics. How do you kill off people? How do you crop people? How do you marginalize their existence? You can do so by marginalizing their gender. So eugenics is not just about killing off the population, it's killing off the very means by which the population progenerates.
If I make you a transgender, and you're doing man on man or woman on woman, boom, that stops reproduction. If we talk about transhumanism, which is basically, we're now integrating with machines and all of that type of stuff. Well, if I'm integrated with a machine, the machine can easily be programmed for me not to reproduce. And then eugenics itself is about being selective about who you let reproduce.
The transgenderism, the basic word is trans. In other words, they are segueing you from one structure into another. And the more they segue you from transgenderism to transhumanism, the more they are putting you into control, a control grid. That control grid is AI. Okay, so that the end result of the beginning of any transitioning process is to place you into a whole new corridor, a whole new paradigm of control.
Every single administration since Nixon has engaged in curing the problem of black masculine hostility through two means: a carceral solution and a chemical solution. Carceral meaning mass incarceration. Nixon initiated the process of mass incarceration, which the black community suffers from today, mass incarceration and mass drugging.
After World War II, technology began to boom, and the ideas behind advancing technology was to eliminate human participation. We are at a stage now where technology and artificial intelligence can remove all necessary human participation in pretty much about everything. So the surplus humans are no longer necessary, and the plan is to get rid of at least 5 billion people.
60% of the groceries you would buy at a grocery store, 60% have been bio-infused with soy isolate. Why? Because they first piloted this in the prisons, infusing prison food with soy because they discovered soy is a great feminizer. Soy, when ingested, becomes estrogenic, the female hormone estrogen. So you eat a lot of soy, males start developing man breasts or man boobs.
Incarceration, you have a lot of brothers and even sisters who go behind what we call the G wall, right? They go behind the wall and they don't come out the same. You know, think about brothers and sisters who've been locked up for 10 years, 20 years, and the things that they witnessed from being inside. You know, sometimes your cell might be raided, or if you get into it or you get on the wrong side of the guard, you're in lockdown where you can only come out for 1 hour, right? And then you're locked down for 23 hours. Sometimes the entire jail is locked down. So it's a lot of buck breaking happening right in the penal system.
The LGBT history narrative is a way to, again, promote the over-sexualizing of men, women, and primarily children. It is a way to normalize everything from sodomy to pedophilia. It is a way, again, to go towards the eventual perfected maneuver, strategic, calculated agenda, which is depopulation.
In Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University had an arrangement with the local courts where in lieu of prison or in lieu of jail, if a criminal was caught, instead of going to jail, they would get a sex change.
If you read vaccination literature, when they were developing vaccinations back in the day, and I don't know if they're still doing this, but they would test the vaccines out on the imprisoned population.
Nixon initiated chemically subduing the inner cities through the methadone clinics, passing out free methadone. Methadone was more addictive, not just more addictive than heroin, but methadone was a more potent anti-testosterone. Methadone was a more potent feminizer than heroin. So the Nixon administration put these methadone clinics throughout the black community where methadone was given away for free.
Well, if you want to deal with the prisons, there's a substance called saltpeter. Now, saltpeter is actually potassium nitrate. And the brothers in the house, in the big house, brothers in lockup, they call it saltpeter.
The state-by-state legalization of marijuana is one of the greatest contributors to the gender neutering of Black America.
Now that we understand how deep and insidious the buck-breaking agenda really is, we now have to ask the question, how do we combat the nonstop barrage of buck-breaking propaganda, miseducation, medical, and social attacks that we as black people are subjected to on a daily basis?
There's a left-wing white organization called the Rainbow Railroad. And the Rainbow Railroad, it helps out black LGBT people who live in Africa and the Caribbean. It helps them get resources to come over here to the United States. Now, look how they got the name Rainbow Railroad. Remember, the rainbow term, that was Fred Hampton from the Black Panthers. The railroad, that's a reference to the Underground Railroad, something that foundational black Americans created. So they got the Rainbow Railroad, where they get black LGBT people from other countries and bring them here. And what's interesting, the white media, they will let these black LGBT people from Africa and the Caribbean act as the de facto spokespersons for foundational black American society. Now, why do they do that? Because when foundational black Americans start talking about reparations, when we start talking about tangibles, when we start talking about getting resources that we need, all of a sudden we get these people who were on the Rainbow Railroad that nobody knows, they just popped out of nowhere. All of a sudden they're talking about, well, what about trans issues? What about LGBT issues? What about women's issues? They start talking about gender and sexuality while they're winking to their white sponsors who put them out there to do this. So we have to understand when certain people have been put in certain positions to be the spokespersons for black foundational society, and we have to know how to reject that when it's not conducive to the good of our community.
There are 4 major companies that control the media. And so what we need to do as a people is control our media and also educate our own children. Malcolm X said, you know, only a fool would allow his enemies to educate his children.
Anything you get from mass media, reject it. And here's the other thing. Man Up is about protecting womanhood and promoting manhood.
And as we are continually bombarded with images of over-sexualized black youth, bombarded with images where we don't see holistic, healthy relationships between black men and women, we are going to continue to fail to see each other as human beings, and we're actually going to be a liability to ourselves. This is the reason why the propaganda continues.
I think media literacy is extremely important starting from childhood. Again, we're constantly consuming these images that are fed to us, but if we have some sort of decoding system to frame why is this media given to us, that I think that can be a protective mechanism.
It is the quintessential fruition of what Karl Marx said, that religion is the opiate of the people. That somehow now, instead of being the revolutionaries, black preachers are being used as a narcotic to put our people to sleep in a time where they should be wide awake and standing out in the streets and seeking justice.
We have to recognize that strong families, strong relationships between particularly men and women is that which undergirds society. And as long as we still have the remnants of the control of our sexual relationships, we cannot truly become a powerful, self-sufficient people.
That I believe that the strong, independent black woman trope is something that is killing us as black women, because it creates this mentality that we can do it on our own and we can't. You know, independence is death. Interdependence is what it's all about. Like, we can't do this by ourselves. We can't, and the fact that we're trying to is, we're having all sorts of different type of ailments, all sorts of issues, and it messes up the whole dynamic of how things are supposed to be. So it is a backhanded compliment. You know, it's not something that any other race of women get. You don't hear strong, independent Asian woman or strong, independent Hispanic woman or white woman or anything like that. We're the only ones who get that label, and it's a backhanded compliment because it makes it seem like we can't rely on our men to be strong for us, and we can if we allow them to.
And if we do not have a plan in place, set aside through nutrition, through education, not deducation, through a reorganization of what family means, back to old school, what family is about, to raise the male in the society again to his purpose, and that is to be the provider and the protector.
Masculinity is a set of behavioral protocols that you input into a boy, so he is conditioned to be unable to deviate from them. Essentially, that's duty, honor, obligation, responsibility, accountability, dependability, work ethic, furthering his intelligence, his education, making where he lives a better, safer, more secure place filled with economic prosperity, morality, ethics, and a sense of purpose.
All people have three sources of power. Moral, ethical, and cultural power is one, and it's the most important one. Economic and political power, and third, military power. Military is the lowest, weakest form of power. Let me give you an example. You've got children. If you tell your child, do this for daddy, all you have to do is say, daddy wants you to do this or that. That's a good child. It just does because you have that kind of rapport, right? Or next thing is, give them some money or I'll give you some privileges. Then, if you have to beat or knock or go upside that kid's head, you don't have much of a relationship. You're only in charge as long as you're knocking them upside the head or punishing them or showing them that you can hurt them, okay? That is the power of white people. The only thing that they've got is that they can beat up on people.
You do need to know, when you out there and you are being pulled over by a cop or something like that, man, understand, that man is gonna beat whatever happened. Sometimes they get a family a little shut the fuck up money. And we saw what happened with that last one. It was embarrassing. That one lawyer who lose every case. If he knock on my door, I'm slamming the door and letting the pit bull loose on that motherfucker.
We keep thinking we're going to take power back. No, we're not going to take power back because they don't have the power. We have the power. All we have to do is assume our power.
Elders respect youth, youth respect elders. If we just loved and cared about each other, we would be significantly in the position to handle this. And if we can start with where you are, who thinks, who gives a damn, we're not going to save everybody, but those that would be saved, work with them. That's my suggestion.
Look at other groups of people. I was told that here in America, Asian people, right in Howard County in Maryland, Asian people send their children to the public school system. I always say the public school system, but the public school system. But then when they're finished, I was told that a bus gets them and transports them to another school where they learn their history, their culture, and their language. Our children don't have that. They're totally at the mercy of the public school system. And so we need to start educating our babies. That's a must.
We have to unite our own media outlines, our own media sources, our own media companies, unite in efforts to promote what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman, in the standard way, in the way that got us all here. That's not a problem. If you can promote how gay you can be, I should be able to promote how masculine and natural I can be. There's nothing to do with, I'm just fighting you. No, I'm promoting me. I'm promoting us. Everyone gets to promote their narrative. But when we promote our narrative, it's demonized. So we have to remove that idea that it's going to be demonized, etc.
One of the key tenets of Christianity is forgiveness. In the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. They use scripture like, if you don't forgive your brother here, then your Father will not forgive you in heaven. And they use that with the victims of white supremacy, anti-black bigotry, and racism to tell them in order to be a good Christian, you've got to forgive. It doesn't matter how heinous the crime against you or your family was. If you want to make it to heaven, you've got to forgive. Now, the ironic thing is, this is a practice that whites and evangelical Christians don't use themselves. They say when they feel like they've been done wrong, never forget.
You learn your enemy, but you don't stay so focused on your enemy and what he's done to you that you forget how to do it to him, or learn how to do it to him, or study him as a target, not as an oppressor, but as a target.
I saw people forgiving for what happened in at Emmanuel Church down in Charleston. I mean, the body's not even cold and you forgave? You got a black family. Do folks forgive when someone takes the Aretha Franklin LPs out of mama's house when she dies? People don't talk to each other 20, 30 years over who had the most pound cake at someone's funeral, whatever. I don't believe it. If black people really had any forgiveness, we'd be using it on each other. So if you don't forgive your own, you can't forgive white people. It's a lie.
We need counseling. We have a lot of pain, and we're carrying it. And we carry it in our homes because the dominant culture may not allow us to express it in the workplace. So we bottle it up and we bring it home to our children and to our wives, to our girlfriends, to our families. We need counseling. We need to talk.
The white elite understands who we are. We keep acting like, oh, they're just doing that because they don't know who we are. So we just tell them who we are, they'll treat us nice. No, the white elite understand who you are. And if you come into being as rulers of the world, he will eventually not exist at all in the world.
Black people, ironically, don't have a military, have been denied having the kind of economic or political base by which they could draw upon, but they do have moral, ethical, cultural power. It's the last thing we have.
You are charged with homophobia if all you do is say, I'm proud to be straight. To take pride in being a heterosexual is offensive, is considered an offense.
We have to take control of the narrative and post the things that we want to see and let people know that these things, like successful black families and just successful black people, period, exist. Those are the type of things that we have to promote and push forward.
We have to promote the successful black family. We have to promote the successful black male. And I say successful because we continue to see the unsuccessful. We continue to see the loser type of picture. We have to promote the successful black woman, successful black man, successful black society, self-sustaining, uplifting, loving, promoting that which increases the unification between us as a people.
One of the things I'm doing with a small group of black men in the academy is creating our own curriculum and our own field of study, black male studies. And it's directed at actually exposing what has been happening in different contexts with black men beyond stereotype, beyond other people's opinions, and actually looking at the data as a starting point and not anecdotes that people want to give about black men. That's the starting point for us, and that's the work we're trying to do as a collective of black men producing information about real black men's lives.
Enslavement didn't end because good white folk came into their right minds. Enslavement ended because Africans fought in the interior, fought on the shores, fought on the ships, fought on the plantation, and destroyed enslavement.
We got our own flavor, our own style, our own everything. And I am perfectly fine with being a black, heterosexual male from Compton, in America, and an original man on the planet. Ain't got no interest in no man outside of just loving my brother, who you are, boom. But I want a woman and I want a black family, and that's perfectly fine.
We're the only danger to white false notion of supremacy. Asians are not any danger. They're wannabes, even though they have a different cultural approach to it. Latinos are no different. They're wannabes, even though they are African too to some degree. The only group that endangers white supremacy, that endangers what the white man concept of a man is, that endangers what a white man concept of a woman is the African group, and particularly the African American.
We have to be the ones to lift up their stories and to teach our children what happened on these plantations and what happened to these resilient people that came before us. Not only do we tell their stories, but we continue their legacy of struggle. They never gave up. Regardless of what they went through, they always continued the struggle for liberation. And it is on their shoulders that we stand today. And so we would abdicate our responsibility and desecrate their memory if we live this life and we don't continue to fight against white supremacy, racism, and anti-black bigotry, if we don't continue to cry loud and spare not against injustice. That is how we continue their legacy. That is how we continue to honor them.